Hey guys, so today we're going to just talk about, I think, a really important part of obesity that people don't ever really talk about. And that has to do with the fact that obesity actually lowers dopamine in the brain. So I want to talk about this because there's a lot of advice, especially online and especially in general, that is often talking about going on dopamine detoxes or lowering your dopamine as much as possible and doing this kind of stuff to kind of cleanse yourself. And I just have to say that that is horrible advice for somebody who is obese and beyond. So let's go ahead and get into my experience with low dopamine in obesity. And I guess this is really just about an awareness of it. So what goes on with low dopamine? Low dopamine causes lower motivation. It can cause depression. It can cause a lot of stuff, basically. And it can also increase your cravings for food. It can do a lot of, there's certain like muscle tightness and things that can occur with low dopamine as well. And I think the biggest factor for obesity in general is the low motivation. So what does it take to lose weight? Motivation. What does it take to start a routine, get a deficit going, do all this stuff, go to the gym, right? It takes dopamine. So I think a lot of times in our society, like I said, there's kind of this serotonin bias. I don't know how else to describe it, but we are constantly inundated with messages that our serotonin is too low, that we need to increase our serotonin. Serotonin is opposed to dopamine. So if your serotonin is higher, then your dopamine will seem lower. People always forget that hormones are often in relationship to each other. And when it comes to other disorders, like specifically hypothyroidism, which is highly associated with especially supermorbid obesity, dopamine tends to be lower in people with hypothyroidism. Serotonin tends to be higher in people with hypothyroidism. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I want you to understand that a lot of this advice will not help you. There's a lot of advice out there that says, for example, to cut out coffee, to cut caffeine. That's not necessarily great advice for somebody who's obese for a lot of different reasons. Caffeine, for example, it does help your body not absorb estrogen as well, which can be good for people who have high estrogen, people who are obese, super morbidly obese. For example, their estrogen will be highly elevated. People who have fatty liver, their estrogen will be highly elevated. Caffeine helps. Caffeine also helps the brain hold on to dopamine. So when you're in an obese state, caffeine, in a lot of cases and in my experience, has been the difference between getting up and doing the day and not getting up and doing the day. And I think that it's important that we acknowledge that obesity puts us in a separate state. There is this idea that an obese individual is the same as somebody who isn't obese. There's this idea that, again, morbid obese, super morbid obese, all of these levels are exactly the same as a thin person. It's just not true. My experience with low dopamine has become especially stark in obesity, in the obese phase. I think because a lot of other health issues started to recede. So I stopped having this feeling of impending death, of supermorbid obesity. I stopped being so extremely depressed like I was in morbid obesity, or, just constantly shifting between these mental states of anxiety and depression and all these different things. And it was still very much just more focused on other aspects. Even physical health aspects were so much louder. Even things like hypoventilation were so much louder. Knee pain was so much louder in morbid obesity, as morbid obesity has its own issues, in my opinion, with serotonin levels. But when I got to obesity, things shifted pretty dramatically. And I started to feel kind of bored again. I felt super bored when I was super morbidly obese. I felt super bored when I was morbidly obese. But there were just all these other issues to look at, all these other physical crises, mental health issues, just things that I could focus on in regard to the obesity. So the boredom aspect was something I kind of just had to deal with as I dealt with all these other whack-a-mole problems of being hugely fat. When I got to obesity, that low dopamine became the primary problem. It's kind of like all these other issues were going on before, and it made the dopamine issue seem small. But as they all receded, this dopamine issue became really drastic. And I remembered throughout morbid obesity, I had horrible nightmares. I had extreme restlessness. While I was sleeping, I would thrash around at night very often with these nightmares and just feeling restless in general, sitting on the couch, And I found that these issues are a lot less now that I'm just obese, but the motivation piece is so much worse in obesity. And I think it's because you don't have this feeling of impending doom, this feeling of fear, this feeling, I don't have these nightmares and all this stuff. It becomes extremely easy to be complacent and to just kind of stay where you're at. So obesity provides its own obstacles, which often have to do with discipline and motivation. It has to do with finding the gumption to continue to get out. Because a lot of people get to this point, they start to feel okay, and they think, well, I'm done. I did it. It was hard. I'm done. And they stop. And the issue is, when you sit at this level, your dopamine is still low. Your D2 receptors are less in obesity. So it changes your personality. It changes how you view things. You become a little bit more boring. You become more depressive or sad. You become all these different things. You start to crave food more, and you start to have, in some cases, you engage in riskier behaviors as well, similar to people who have, ADHD, for example. You can start to have focusing issues. I've had a lot of that lately. I know you guys have seen it when I've worn this hoodie on this channel. There have been times where I have filmed and I had zero focus. I was really, really struggling to get to the point of the video. And it's something that I've shown on purpose because I want people to see what it's like. Because that feeling of what I call drunkenness, or it's similar to drunkenness, it's really difficult to stay disciplined. And I don't think it's impossible to overcome. I think the main issue is that people don't acknowledge that it's happening because it's subtle. I only notice it because I pay such close attention because I had to get out of super morbid obesity. So because of that skill set, that sort of obsessive, constant monitoring process I had to engage in to get out of super morbid obesity, I can still pay that close attention now, and I see the dopamine issues. And as I have taken another break from the gym, another week-long break, I see how drastic the low dopamine problems are, because it's become probably the biggest health issue I currently have. And so with that, it becomes so stark. And I just want you to know that it's a factor. If you're tired all the time, if you have no motivation, and you don't have other hormonal issues, this could be part of it. If you're restless, if you are constantly, bored or uninterested in activities, or if you cannot focus on anything, there's a lot of overlap between hypothyroidism and ADHD as well, which people do not acknowledge all the time. And it's really important. As I've established many times on this channel, hypothyroidism is extremely misunderstood, but a lot of symptoms of ADHD are similar to hypothyroidism. So it's very important to normalize your weight. For example, if you're looking at an ADHD diagnosis, it's also important to look at, were these issues always present? For me personally, they weren't. I didn't have focusing issues growing up. I didn't have any issues like that as a child. I may have been a little bit rebellious, I may have been a little bit brat, but it was often because of being forced to do nap time when I couldn't sleep and I was bored out of my mind as a child. It's a little bit different. But in terms of when we look at ADHD or ADD, these things exist in childhood from the beginning. So if this is something that you developed, if you used to be super focused, if you used to be fine, for example, a lot of people used to be able to read books and focus on them, but they can't now, that's more of a hypothyroid thing. If you just can't or never could, that might be different. That might be a different category, if that makes any sense. So I think it's really important to, sorry, I just got a text. Speaking of focusing issues, I think it's really important to look at the trajectory of your life and see if these things developed, and see if it developed around the time you became obese. Because if it did, it's probably the obesity. It's probably more associated with hypothyroidism. But you can have a lot of the same symptoms. So I think all I'm trying to do with this video is just bring awareness to this. Understand as well, get your ass to the gym. The most effective method at increasing dopamine is exercise. And especially in people who are not ADHD or people who don't have that problem, exercise is extremely effective, to the point where a lot of my low dopamine symptoms that I have, they go away with a trip to the gym. So I would say, honestly, exercise is probably even more vital in a lot of ways in obesity than in other phases of the journey. Because I could see so many people getting stuck here. I could see so many people not getting out of this stage because there is such a distinct lack of motivation that I have talked about from the beginning of this, that I'm going to continue to talk about now. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with an understanding that within obesity, there's going to always be issues with this. You have to get out. Again, we don't accept it. You don't accept obesity, you get out of it. If you're obese, it's still blunting who you are. It's still clouding a part of who you are, because your dopamine levels are not where they would naturally be. I'm sorry. So I think it's really important to know that and work with it. So do not take advice on upping serotonin constantly. Don't do that. It's probably too high, or your dopamine is already too low if you're obese. So don't think about it that way. Don't think about it as a constant state of, I must have more serotonin. It is not helpful. Remember that all hormones need to be balanced. And I don't know why society is so obsessed with serotonin and so obsessed with dopamine cleanses and these kinds of things, but we have to not listen to this stuff as an obese person. So I think the other thing that we have to do is try to raise our dopamine naturally. Do everything you can. Now, it's hard. I do struggle with sleep as a part of low dopamine symptoms. I struggle with especially upper back muscle stiffness. I struggle with restlessness. At times I've had restless legs, etc. I don't have that as bad now. That was really a morbid obesity phase where it was really bad. I struggle with a lot of those types of things, but they're all heavily mitigated by going to the gym. So I will say again, the gym is your number one. But there's going to be some other things that could help. Caffeine is something that can help you. Now, always just have one serving of it. I wouldn't suggest having like 10 cups of coffee or like extreme energy drinks or anything like that. Just a cup of coffee will do you wonders. If you can stomach it, if you can handle it, etc., it can do wonders for an obese person in terms of focus. So that's something that I would suggest as well. When we get to other stuff, it can get kind of controversial, but sometimes it's that bad. So we're going to talk about some more controversial ways of getting your dopamine up. So another way of doing it is honestly doom scrolling, watching horror movies, watching these like dark stuff. You know, I've had to do that a lot when I was super morbidly obese, but even as an obese person, it kind of helps, honestly. I don't always doom scroll now. I don't always need to, as those dopamine levels are not as bad. Also, fighting with people on the internet, that is also a huge dopamine booster. Again, it's not the most productive, but in times of desperation, it can work. It can help you become more motivated. And, you know, I certainly did it in 2022, for example. I was so low in dopamine that I had to literally survive, and it helped. So I'm not saying it's great. I'm just saying it can get you through a rough patch. Another thing that we have to talk about that is controversial, which I'm going to have you guys really look at it from a gray area, not black and white, but PORN. So in absolute desperate situations, it has helped when I have had extremely low dopamine. And I don't think it's ever good to be super dependent on any of these things, but we have to stop thinking about it as like, if you have one cup of coffee, you're totally addicted. Or if you use PORN once a week, you're totally addicted to or obsessed. It's like, I think that there's some gray areas here, or like doom scrolling. It's always bad for everybody all the time. Not necessarily. It can be motivating for some. And if you do it once every few days, it can just kind of get you through. Might even help at the gym or something. I mean, we have to think about some of these things in a slightly different way, because a lot of advice that is geared towards people, it is not geared towards obese people. I have said many times, this is a phase where people probably tend to be told that they're a fat piece of shit and that they need to get to the gym and they need to do this and do that. And it is important to not slip too far into that kind of stuff and make sure you're not hating your body from like a toxic ritualistic place. But if you're just kind of being harsher or disciplined with yourself, I think this is a stage where it could help. You know, I had a whole video where I told myself I was mid. I said, you're mid. You're delusional and mid. You know, at the end of the day, as far as I've lost weight, I'm still so many people starting weight. And it's something that I have to accept. and it's not great. But again, mid is not horrible. So you can also kind of be critical of yourself in a way that is not as bad or like really harsh. So I think that that's also important. The other thing that we have to remember is socialization. So especially for introvert girlies and boilies, socialization can take a huge backseat. I have heavily relied upon socialization throughout this time. I am often talking on the phone to people, and it's been extremely important in terms of keeping dopamine in check. And so it's really important to have friends or to have people you can talk to, be around people. It's extremely helpful with low dopamine. But always remember to be balanced with these things. And remember to do the gym. Remember to do the gym. Gym is number one. Exercise is a requirement. It's not, don't think of it as something that just doesn't really matter. It's very, very important. So that's number one. If you're struggling with low dopamine, go to exercise first. If you're already exercising, then you can look at other stuff. So I would go to exercise, a cup of coffee. Start there. If it's still bad, then we can get into some of the gray area stuff like sugar, porn, fighting with people online, doom scrolling, horror, right? A lot of stuff like that. Then we can look at those things after, but always remember to prioritize the most healthful habits first and do that first so that you're not overly relying or sublimating a natural desire for activity through other toxic or less savory, less wholesome things. But sometimes those less wholesome things can help in a pinch. And at the end of the day, we are focusing on obesity. We are focusing on losing weight and getting out of this. So honestly, you have to sometimes prioritize that goal. If you have other goals, like you want to be off of a lot of these things, that's also fine. If you can handle it, that's also fine. But if you can't, okay. Like if you're like, I'm going to stop doing this, that, or the other. Like I'm going to quit caffeine to the point where you're totally not having it whatsoever, but you literally can't even go to the gym anymore because you're not having it. Or you can't even try to lose weight anymore because you're not having it. Like we have to think about priorities. So remember, my opinion on weight loss is that it should always be your top priority, but not your only priority. So definitely prioritize it, especially in obesity. I've noticed it is so easy for it to slip into the background. So be very mindful of that. And let me know if you guys have any other dopamine suggestions. Please put them in the comments. Thank you so much for listening to my controversial video. But I'm just really hoping to increase awareness and help people understand these things. So I will talk to you guys later. Have a very good rest of your day, night, etc. I hope you had a wonderful holiday, Christmas, and I hope that you guys are looking forward to the new year. I'm looking forward to getting back to everything tomorrow. I'm filming this on Christmas Day. I'm so looking forward to getting back to my routine and judging everybody who isn't. I'm just kidding. Anyways, you guys, I will talk to you guys later. Have a good one. Peace.